Hello there. Welcome to another edition of me reading the Hope Chest for you. Remember that you can be reading along in the book. You can be reading the book, or you can just read the book, or you can just listen to me. I've got two pictures on here. One is a picture of Carrie Chapman Catt. She was a leader in the women's suffrage movement, and by this time, 1920, she had become one of the highest ranked leaders in the women's suffrage movement, one of the ones that was really coordinating everything. She was about 60 at the time of this book, and so we'll be introduced to her in this chapter. And above Miss Catt is a $100 bill. We find out we've talked before about how the anti-suffragists were bribing legislators to vote against women's suffrage. And remember, bribery, it's illegal, right? You shouldn't be able to be paid to vote one way or another. It's illegal. It's also very unethical. But in this, we're introduced to Mr. Hanover, and another suffragist comes and says that, hey, the anti-suffragist just paid me $300. And so I want you to pay attention to that interaction between Mr. Hanover and this other suffragist that's trying to be bought off by the anti-suffragist, and see how Mr. Hanover handles it, because he's a suffragist. So, and just so you know, $300 in 1920 would be worth about $3,000 now. $3,600 is what this website's telling me. So money tends to just increase over time. It's called inflation. So, these legislators that are getting paid $300 to vote for the anti-suffragists, in today's money, that's $3,000, and that's a good chunk of change. I would take $3,000 in a heart, maybe not to vote a certain way, but if someone offered me $3,000, that's a good chunk of change. All right, let's get to the reading. Mr. Martin had gotten away again. He had told Myrtle to stay at home, but Myrtle, who was sick of Dead Horse Alley and of Mrs. Reddy's hints that Myrtle ought to be in some sort of institute instead of traveling around with a suspicious-looking white man, followed him. They went back down 6th Avenue toward Capitol Hill, and then around the hill and along Union Street toward the Hermitage. It was Saturday night, and the streets were crowded. There were white people everywhere, some with yellow or red roses, and some without. Some were driving an open automobile, stopping in the middle of the street to talk to passerby and holding up traffic. Horns honked. The music of a piano player came from an open doorway, a song that had been popular as long as Myrtle could remember. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Myrtle would have liked to sing along, but she had to keep silent because she was busy turning invisible. She wove through the crowds, and no one saw her. Then Mr. Martin went into the Hermitage. Colored people weren't allowed inside, and it was much more difficult to be invisible in places you weren't allowed to be. There was a doorman with a double row of gold buttons on his coat. Myrtle retreated. There was another entrance around the side. There was a doorman here, too, but a group of suffragists with yellow ribbons on their hats went in, and Myrtle slipped silently in with them. The desk clerk at the Hermitage was much too harassed to see Myrtle. The lobby was full of white people, all talking loudly. Myrtle slid in among them, concentrating as hard as she could on being invisible. They were busy talking to each other and talking about each other. Myrtle could feel their gazes slide around her. She was doing a good job. There was a quiet-looking area with some potted ferns and cut velvet sofas. It looked like a good place for Mr. Martin to be hiding. A man and woman were sitting on one of the sofas talking, but they weren't Miss Chloe and Mr. Martin. "I've just come from the train station, Mr. Hanover," the woman was saying. "We had to let some of the legislators leave town. After all, it's the weekend. But we're afraid that those that won't accept a bribe to change their vote might accept a bribe to just go home and stay there." A tall, bony man with tufts of gray hair in his ears came over to them. "Joe!" "Evening, Miss White." He nodded vaguely at the lady. "Joe, I gotta tell you know that leak in my barn roof?" Mr. Hanover looked wary and put a hand over his stomach as though it hurt. "You have a leak in your barn roof?" "Yeah. Well, them antis offered me $300 to vote against ratification. You know I'm with the Suffs, Joe. I've been with the Suffs since way back. But $300, and with that leak in the roof—" He trailed off and looked at Joe hopefully. $300? Mr. Hanover sounded outraged. "That's all they offered you? Everyone else who votes with the antis are getting $1,000. $1,000? The legislator stared. $1,000, and they offered me a measly $300 for my vote? Them lousy no-good antis, what do they take me for? Forget them." The man stalked off, and Miss White and Mr. Hanover laughed. Myrtle would have liked to have laughed too, but you couldn't do that when you were invisible. Mr. Hanover suddenly grabbed his stomach again and winced. "Can't wait to tell Mrs. Cat about that," he said. "That was funny." So I want to pause right there and ask you the question. Think about this. Were the anti-suffragists really paying legislators $1,000 to vote against women's suffrage? They were not. That's something Mr. Hanover just said so that he would be mad, so that this other guy would be mad at the at the anti-suffragists, because he thinks, they paid him $300, but he thinks everyone else is getting paid $1,000. Then all of a sudden he thinks he's getting ripped off. And so then he goes to vote back for the suffragists again. So kind of just some little tricky, sneaky stuff going on there. Myrtle edged carefully out into the lobby again. Mr. Martin was nowhere to be seen. He would be looking for Miss Chloe, of course. Myrtle was afraid that if she didn't manage things right, Miss Chloe was going to be Mr. Martin's downfall. Myrtle slid along invisibly to a room that she could tell from the sounds and from the gravy smells must be the dining room. She couldn't go inside since she didn't trust her invisibility, walking right past the white-suited white headwaiter. She peered in the door as best she could. She didn't see Mr. Martin. She slid back into the lobby. She climbed up the stone staircase to the balcony. She had gone up there to get a better view, but the balcony was full of people wearing red roses. One woman looked directly at Myrtle. Thinking fast, Myrtle whipped out her handkerchief and dropped to her knees and began dusting the balcony railing. At the Girls' Training Institute, they had always been sticklers for dusting railings and that sort of detail. At least that's what Myrtle remembered from the few classes she'd bothered to attend. Anyway, it worked. As soon as she started dusting, she became invisible again. Down below, Myrtle saw Mr. Martin crossing the lobby with Miss Chloe in his arm. They went up a little staircase to a veranda at the front of the lobby. Myrtle hurriedly pocketed her handkerchief and went back downstairs to follow them. The veranda was made of stone with a vaulted stone ceiling. It stretched the length of the hotel along 6th Avenue. Down below, Myrtle could hear automobiles and a few horses passing, and the voices of people in the street. There was nobody on the veranda but Mr. Martin and Miss Chloe, and a very old white lady wearing an enormous hat. The old lady was approaching Miss Chloe. Myrtle moved toward them cautiously. Just then Violet came onto the veranda and ruined everything by saying, "Hi, Myrtle!" Everyone turned to look at Myrtle. "Hi," said Myrtle, very annoyed. "What is this?" the old lady demanded. "Mrs. Cat, this is my friend Theo Martin," said Miss Chloe, looking tired, "and my sister Violet, and her little friend Myrtle." "Your sister seems to be an anti," said Mrs. Cat. "I'm not an anti, Mrs. Cat," said Violet, covering her red rose with her hand. "I'm just wearing this. In fact, I wanted to tell Chloe—" "Preposterous," said Mrs. Cat. "Just wearing the anti-suffrage rose? Do you have any idea how many women have lived their whole lives, yes, and died too, for your right to vote, and you're just wearing an anti-suffrage rose?" Mr. Martin looked at the old lady with interest. "You must be Carrie Chapman Catt. I would be honored to shake your hand." He grabbed her hand and shook it, which Myrtle thought was brave of him considering the way Mrs. Cat was glaring at him. "You're a Bolshevik, aren't you?" said Mrs. Cat. She turned to Miss Chloe. "We do not need this, Miss Mayhew," Mrs. Cat said. "We do not need anarchists and Negroes." "I'm not an anarchist," said Mr. Martin. "I'm a socialist." "I don't know about you, Mrs. Cat," said Miss Chloe coldly, "but I'm fighting for the right to vote for Negroes, too." Myrtle suddenly felt a rush of affection for Miss Chloe. "Fine," said Mrs. Cat, "but that doesn't mean you have to parade your little colored friend around now and scare these old Confederates and the legislator out of voting for suffrage. Do you know what a legislator from Mississippi told me?" There was silence. "He told me," Mrs. Cat went on, "that the reason he was opposed to women's suffrage was that the white men in Mississippi beat up any Negro man who tries to vote, and that he really didn't like the idea of having to beat up a woman, not even a black one," he said. Myrtle stared at Mrs. Cat. She couldn't tell if Mrs. Cat thought this was a bad thing or a good thing or just a thing that was. "So, keep your little colored friends and Bolsheviks hidden, please, until after the vote. Do you know how long we fought to reach this moment? 72 years, Mrs. Cat said. 72 years. Do you hear me? And now at the scene of the final battle, you play games, you wear the enemy's colors, you treat the culmination of our years of sacrifice as if it were nothing more than a game of... She seemed at a loss to say what kind of game it was, and Myrtle wasn't about to suggest one. Mrs. Cat was a frightening old lady. "Chloe, I really need to tell you something," said Violet. I beg your pardon," she added as an afterthought. Myrtle had noticed that Violet's well-bred manners had been steadily deteriorating ever since they'd met. Personally, Myrtle thought this was a great improvement in Violet. What Myrtle knew about the white people with well-bred manners was that they required servants to wait on them, and Myrtle was against that. Violet looked at Mrs. Cat as if trying to decide whether she could be trusted, and then apparently decided she could, on what grounds Myrtle couldn't imagine. Violet hurriedly gabbled out something about a plot to kidnap one of the self-legislators, although she wasn't sure which one. Mr. Hanover, said Mrs. Cat promptly, our floor leader in the House. He needs a bodyguard. I've been saying that all along. I'll have Mrs. Dudley talk to Governor Roberts about it immediately. Is he really a foreign Bolshevik? Said Violet, interested. No, he's a lawyer from Memphis, said Mrs. Cat, but I believe he came from Poland as a child. Who was this fellow you said you heard talking about it? Said Miss Chloe. Someone named Mr. Garlick, said Violet. I hadn't seen him before tonight. A mystery man, said Mrs. Cat grimly. We've run into mystery men in every single state. They always show up when the legislator is debating the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Nobody ever knows where they came from. A hotel belltop came out on the veranda. Excuse me, ladies, he said, then his eyes rested on Myrtle. I beg your pardon, but we don't allow colored people in the hotel. Come along, Myrtle, said Mr. Martin. Excuse us, ladies. I'll go talk to Mrs. Dudley now about that bodyguard, said Chloe. After you do that, let's all go out for ice cream, Mr. Martin suggested. In the alley, Myrtle muttered as she followed Violet and him off the veranda. Chapter 16, Politics and Gunplay. Thanks for listening.